After 7, on to this now. Could flights be turned away from OR Tambo? Uncertainty about the supply of jet fuel could certainly mean delays or even cancellations. An OR Tambo International Airport fuel supplier is expected to temporarily shut down next month, and the airports company South Africa is taking steps, we are told, to mitigate against the scenarios I've just raised questions about. But will it all be resolved in time? And what happens if we cannot guarantee the consistency of fuel supply? Are there alternatives? To answer that question and others, we speak this morning to Terence Delomoney from ACSA, their Group Executive Operations Management. Thank you so much, Terence, for speaking to us this morning. What is the prospect of flight cancellations, if not delays, at OR Tambo?
Good morning, Bongani. Good morning to your listeners. Thank you for having me. Listen, I mean, fuel is a critical commodity required, and if fuel cannot be secured, there is always the risk that can happen. And in fact, if you just reflect on the issue in 2022, when we had a supply chain disruption because of the floods, there were a few airlines that cancelled a few flights. But I think everybody and all of the role players in this value chain of providing fuel to airlines do look at having contingency plans in place in order to mitigate that. So yes, that's always a possibility. And in fact, airlines have individual contracts with the oil companies. And when their oil company is indicating to them that they are struggling to have to meet their demands, airlines will take operational decisions. But it's not necessarily, I think, cancelling a flight and cancelling flights is the last resort. There are many steps or many contingencies to look at before you take a decision to cancel, and airlines will consider all of it. And these range from actually reducing payload sometime on flights. So some airlines will decide that they will take on less passengers or less cargo, which means they would consume less fuel. There's options of them, what we call tankering in fuel. So some airlines will bring in fuel from another destination, so they then don't have to uplift at the arriving destination. And there's also what we call technical stops. So some airlines will take in a very minimal amount of fuel at the airport that they are departing from, and they'll stop at another airport to pick up fuel, refuel, and then they can get on to the final destination. So from an airline perspective, there are a number of things that they look at before taking such a decision to cancel.
All right. I understand that stock levels at OR had dipped below the recommended 5 days cover. Is that still the situation? And how did we get here?
Okay, so yes, so the 5 days is what we as industry like to have, is what we call our buffer stock. So to just deal with any short-term interruptions that can happen in the supply chain. And what's happening, we have most of the fuel from OR Tambo. I'd say about 70% of the fuel supply. OR Tambo uses about 3,500 cubic meters of fuel a day. Is supplied from the inland refinery, and that refinery is going on a planned maintenance shutdown between May and June of this year. So obviously what that means, in order for the refinery to plan for their shutdown, they have to start building up their stocks. So over the last few weeks, they've started building up their stocks, which means what they supply into the airport will reduce a bit. So we saw that happening, and in the last week or so, we saw our buffer stock days at the airport reduced to below those 5 days. But what we're seeing now, yesterday and today, we're starting to build up again to over the 5 days. So that's at least coming back on track.
There's also the issue.
So perhaps, Bongani, yes.
No, I was going to say there was also the issue understood of a dispute around pipeline duties. That, of course, involves the South African Revenue Service. What was the issue there?
Okay, so coming to that. So just latching back onto the shutdown for maintenance purposes for a 6-week period between May and June. So the contingency would be then to bring in fuel from Durban primarily on using the multi-product pipeline, and obviously rail, because rail also brings in some commodity, some volumes of fuel. But in order to compensate for the shutdown, most of that fuel will be coming through the multi-product pipeline. So that is the contingency to deal with the shutdown period. Yes, so we've been alerted to there is let's call it a dispute, an issue between the petroleum industry and the South African Revenue Services around, I believe, duties on that fuel that comes in on the pipeline. We as ACSA have been, contacted by the South African Petroleum Industry Association, and also, I would say, concerned about, what could happen if we don't have access to that pipeline. Have been also trying to facilitate and have discussions with SARS, as well as the petroleum industry. I do believe that, the talks are getting to a point where it will now have the situation resolved. So we're quite positive that the situation will be resolved, at least to accommodate us in this period of the shutdown, that will enable then the multi-product pipeline to be used, and that will then deal with the volumes that are required at OR Tambo.
Because I understand there was a meeting between SARS and the South African Petroleum Industry Association yesterday.
Yes, correct. So in fact, during the week, as I said, even as ACSA, we attended that, and there's ongoing discussions. They're quite close to have a short-term resolution, but these matters are quite technical in nature. So I think yesterday they were just finalizing some of the finer detail as to how to implement the short-term plan, and I'm quite confident that sometime today we're going to get the final verdict and the final news on what's happening there.
And just to be clear, in terms of the role of the airports company South Africa, you of course facilitate the work that airlines must do, but you're not directly responsible for any of this.
Yeah, so absolutely, Bongani. It's quite a complex value chain where there are various role players. Our role as airports company, obviously being the airport, we own the fuel infrastructure, so the storage facilities that we have at the airport, the interplane services and the fuel hydrant facilities are owned by ACSA. But the responsibility to bring in the fuel really rests with the fuel suppliers, because they then have contracts with the airlines and they supply the airlines directly, but we give them access to our facilities, to use those facilities to bring the fuel into plane eventually. So there's various role players with various responsibilities. Airlines themselves also need to ensure that they are providing accurate forecasting data to their suppliers, so the suppliers can bring in, can meet their demands. And that's how the system works. We even look at the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy. They also have a role to play to look at issues of long-term security for fuel into the country. So certainly, yes, each role player must do their part to ensure that eventually we can have an aviation industry that allows aircraft to land and take off and not have these issues around fuel.
And as we sit here, though, I think for most people listening to our conversation, the question that will be foremost in their minds are flights guaranteed in the short to medium term in and out of OR Tambo and other airports for that matter?
Yes, for now, certainly the flights are guaranteed. As I said, there might be a few airlines that I'm currently aware of that are looking at some options and alternatives, because they've been notified by their fuel suppliers that due to this temporary impasse, they are not getting enough stocks. So some of those airlines might take operational, but by and large, yes, operations will continue as normal at all of the other airports that ACSA is involved in. There's at this stage there's no such issue, so those flights will continue to operate. And in fact, our other airports within the ACSA network are also available for airlines to use to uplift fuel when needed.
Terence Delomoney is the Group Executive Operations Management at the Airports Company, South Africa.
Current events, developing stories,
tough questions,
your voice making a difference.
This is Breakfast with Bongani Bingwa.